So, we left off yesterday with a little bit of a problem, and the problem was that, well, small organisms, so let's just compare a small organism, so very small organism, small organisms compared to maybe large, complex, multicellular organisms, okay? And what we said was that when organisms are very small, they have a few features, right? So they've got a large surface area to volume ratio, and because of that large surface area to volume ratio, they have a sufficiently high rate of diffusion, okay? Because diffusion is how substances get exchanged. Substances get exchanged by diffusion, but certain factors affect the rate of diffusion, and one of those factors is the surface area to volume ratio. So small organisms have a high surface area to volume ratio, therefore the rate of diffusion is high, and therefore we get sufficient amounts or sufficient level of oxygen supplied, and we get a good rate of removal of carbon dioxide, and so respiration can proceed. Okay, so the rate of respiration is enough for that organism. Okay, now let's contrast that with large organisms. Large organisms have a much lower surface area to volume ratio. Therefore, just using the surface area for exchange would result in a very low rate of diffusion. And I might not say low, I might say, inadequate or insufficient rate or inadequate rate. But guys, we're so chilled out here, I don't even care what word I use. Okay, that's how chill I am, right? So insufficient rate of diffusion, and therefore this organism doesn't get enough oxygen supplied to all the cells, and in fact it also doesn't remove enough CO2 away from cells. Okay, and that's where we left it. Let's move on now, to see how these organisms actually deal with it. All right, so what we're going to say is, in terms of what these organisms could be, well, they could be insects. Okay, because insects are multicellular organisms. You can actually see them with your eyes. Okay, they're actually quite big, relatively speaking. Okay, so they're made up of lots of cells. Not only that, they've got a nervous system. They are quite active, so there's a lot of metabolism going on in all those cells to keep that insect alive. Okay, we have fish. Okay, much then larger organisms. So we're going up in scale. We've got fishes, which are large organisms. Larger organisms, more complex, perhaps even more metabolically active. Okay, so we have fish, and finally we have the largest organisms, most complex, most active, okay, most energy requiring. We have mammals. Okay, so what we're going to look at is, well, in looking at these large organisms, how do they deal? How do they deal with this challenge? How do they get oxygen supplied at a high enough rate to all their cells? Because they've got slightly different ways to do it, but in principle it's the same. Okay, all right, let's move on. Okay, so, and this is how it goes, guys. Okay, so what it is that all these organisms have specialized exchange organs. Okay, or specialized exchange systems. Yeah, so what are they trying to achieve? Well, these specialized systems, they all have one huge feature, which is they all kind of not artificially, but they all kind of find a way to increase the surface area beyond. Like if you look at that organism and you just look at its surface, that surface area that is achieved by these exchange organs is much higher than what you'd think simply looking at that organism. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's just fill this in first. So all of these, so their key feature is that they have a high surface area. But remember, guys, when we talked in the previous episode or discussion, I don't know, guys, I'm so chill, I don't care what you want to call it, okay? But the last time we had this kind of discussion, we talked about the rate of diffusion. And the rate of diffusion, one important equation that relates to the rate of diffusion is called Fick's law. And I find it very useful when I'm trying to kind of connect together the concepts that are common to all these different and very different exchange systems. Okay, so the rate of diffusion is proportional to the surface area multiplied by the concentration gradient divided by the distance of diffusion. Okay, so the higher this is, the higher that is, and the lower this is, makes this value bigger. Okay, and that's a nice kind of numerical. If you're you know, numerically inclined, you might like how that helps to explain, you know, using maths helps to explain how increasing surface area helps the rate of diffusion to increase. Okay, so there we have that relationship. So, and the only reason why I mentioned this, sorry, I'm speaking a bit fast. I'm kind of forgetting that this is supposed to be a chilled discussion or chat. So, apologies. But in terms of Fick's law, how that relates to exchange systems is that they all have evolved to have a high surface area. That's this. They all have evolved to somehow kind of maximize the concentration difference. Okay, so they have a high concentration gradient. And remember, the higher the concentration gradient you have, the higher the rate of diffusion will be, because there's a bigger difference between one concentration or the concentration of something in one place and the concentration of that thing in the other place. So we've got a high surface area, we've got a high concentration gradient, and they all have another key feature, which is a very, very small diffusion distance. Okay? So when we're looking at these different exchange systems, it helps to think in this way. How do they all achieve these things? Actually, we will leave it there. That's all I want to discuss. Okay? That is bite size enough. Okay? So we've discussed what the challenge is, and we've discussed how these different systems are going to address this high rate of diffusion. Now all there remains to see is what their specific adaptations are to achieve those things.